Okay, let's go over your materials for your watercolor. Obviously you need water. You need really fluffy, soft brushes. So that first one I was touching is called a mop brush because it holds a lot of water. Our pigment is going to come in a tube, and then we're going to have our paint palette, which has circles to hold the paint. And you can have a circular palette or the rectangular palette, and then a nice fluffy paper towel that you can kind of blot with and it'll absorb. All right, to get your paint, you just need a little bit of this pigment. Please don't get too much. I'm sorry it's really hard to see here, but I just put a little dab of the paint in one of the little wells, in one of the circles. What am I going to do next? All right, your mop brush, what we're going to do is called wet on wet. So I'm going to get my mop brush full of water, just like a mop holds water, and I'm going to put that water on the paper in the negative space. That's where we're working. So I'm going to get the surface wet, and then I'm going to apply the wet watercolor into this or onto this wet surface, and it's going to start to kind of bleed out, which is going to dry and have these different watercolor effects. So now I'm kind of dabbing the pigment with my wet mop brush, and I'm using the other part of the paint palette to kind of mix the pigment with the paint or the water. And then you can see when I put that onto the wet surface, it has that bleeding out effect where it just kind of moves on its own. So it's controlled because it's only going where I have the water. It's only going in that negative space where I painted it. If I want this to be darker, I would use more pigment, more of that watercolor paint. If I want it to be lighter, I would add more water. And I can use water to kind of spread it around. So now I'm just adding watercolor paint onto the background, that negative space. And I want to keep this negative space kind of light. The next step is going to be adding a shadow. So in order to have the shadow darker, I need the background to be light. Okay, next should be background. So I can wait for this to dry, and I can layer the shadow. I can wait for this to dry, and then I can layer this shadow on top. Or if I'm painting the shadow with the wet paper, it's just, again, that wet on wet process where it might bleed out a little bit. And that's okay. That's just the watercolor effect. So for doing this, I still need a wet brush, but I'm getting more of the pigment. I'm trying to make it darker than that light background. And remember, your shadow, if you're a balloon animal sitting on your table, it's casting a darker shadow. So that's the effect we're trying to get here, this darker shadow on this light background. Voila.